Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back taking a look at another indie book, but today we're not actually looking at a comic. We are looking at The Tale of Rapunzel and the Evil Witch. This is another book from Symbolic World Press, written by Jonathan Pageau and illustrated by Heather Paulington. And if you want a better look at the cover, there it is. This book is part of a very fascinating set of not necessarily reimagined fairy tales, but certainly fairy tales retold for audiences to treasure in a new way. These books have been very interesting so far, and I have already reviewed both Snow White and the Evil Queen and Jack and the Fallen Giants, the previous two books in the series. So if you want my thoughts on those, you can find them on this channel. This is the third book in the series, and it's where you really start to see Pageau's vision for his take on these fairy tales. But before we get too deep into it, let's talk a little bit about the product itself. Symbolic World Press has these really nice hardbound, very portable, great feeling, great looking books. If it's not clear on the camera or from the picture I showed you, these are cloth-bound, hardbacked books. They are very high quality. They will hold up to a lot of repeated readings. If you read your kids a bedtime story before they go to bed every night, you could go through this series several times in a year and still have the books hold up very well to that. The interior paper stock is quite heavy. I'm not good at guessing the weight of paper just by, running my fingers over it, but I would say it's at least 80, probably something more like 100 or 120. So it's very high quality, very thick. It has a nice finish on it, but not a high gloss finish. Not something that is going to be so shiny it actually interferes with the experience of reading the book or appreciating the interior art. Speaking of which, the interior art is very beautiful. Heather Paulington originally illustrated Snow White and the Evil Queen, Snow White and the Widow Queen. Understandable mistake. I hope you follow that. But this is an interior from Rapunzel, and as you can see, she has a very storybook style. The interior art reminds me of nothing quite so much as a stained glass window. Obviously, the coloring and the shading is a little bit subtler than most stained glass windows can do because there's no need to lead all the glass. You don't have to have those frames breaking up the interior illustrations, but the style is very reminiscent of it, and I find it to be very pleasing to the eye. Unlike some stained glass windows where the angling and the posing can be wooden, unnatural, and distracting, Paulington's work is very natural in spite of the fact that it is also very stylized. It feels like these are real people in a storybook world as opposed to paper cutouts put on a flannel graph or something to that effect. The art is laden with symbolic meaning. I'm not the right person to break all of that down for you. In fact, there is an interview between Paulington and Pageau where you can hear them discuss a lot of the symbolic meaning in this story. All in all, by the way, having watched that interview, I do recommend listening to it. It is very helpful in drawing a lot of meaning that might not be immediately intuitive from the story. Pageau is an icon carver and a symbologist. He gets very deep into this kind of thing. And if you want to do more than just read the story over and over again, which there's nothing wrong with, but if you want to dive deeper into it and really mine it for meaning, I highly recommend that interview because there's a lot of stuff in there that I would not have gotten just from reading the book and applying my own knowledge of folklore to it, which is not inconsequential. That said, let's talk a little bit about the story in this book, because as I said before, this is where you really start to get a picture of what Pageau is going for. As I recall, there's going to be 6 of these stories in total, and the first 2 were pretty simple and straightforward. But in this one, we begin to see that there are thematic lines being woven through in the form of recurring characters. In Rapunzel, the witch that locks Rapunzel in her tower is in fact the Widow Queen that tormented Snow White in the first book. And that right there is very interesting because the Widow Queen seemed to be a somewhat wiser figure at the end of that story. She was less vain. She had sacrificed many of the things she took pride in, and that had humbled her quite a bit. But we see in this story, she is still not a good person in control of her worst impulses. And in this case, people who are going to suffer for that, while not entirely blameless, are going to discover that she's not the most benevolent figure that they will ever meet. This story is fascinating for a couple of reasons. Most fairy tales in the modern day are looked at as stories about happy endings with some little kernel of morality in them. This version of Rapunzel is very much a morality story, but it's not exactly a happy one. This is not a story about the positive example. You see, Snow White has already given us that example, and by having it as a reference point in this story, we are now free to explore some of the negative effects of bad decisions. And that is in large part what this story is about. We are first introduced to Rapunzel through her parents, some woodcutters who are unable to have children. But over time, they eventually have Rapunzel, and they treasure her, but to feed her, they do something immoral, and that comes with consequences. That's how Rapunzel winds up locked up in the tower. And from there, the witch is never cruel to Rapunzel, but she does keep her very isolated. She does not give her the tools needed to defend herself. She just scares her about the outside world. And when the outside world eventually intrudes on Rapunzel in the tower, Rapunzel makes some bad decisions, probably because she was never built up by her mother figure. She was not given the virtues and ethics needed to properly parse this situation. And the prince, Zoran, is not really any better in this situation. He continues to visit Rapunzel in her tower, but he never takes any steps to get her out of there. And he's a prince. I mean, you'd think he'd be able to do something. This has pretty bad consequences for both Rapunzel and Zoran. They wind up in a pretty bad way. And I think having the freedom to investigate different responses to bad situations and the kinds of consequences that come from that, while still maintaining that ethical core to the canon of stories overall, is very beneficial. I don't think this story would have rang quite as strongly with me if I didn't already know that Snow White and the Widow Queen had examined what it meant to be a virtuous woman, and Jack and the Fallen Giants had examined what it means to be a brave man. By having those stories as a yardstick to measure the characters in Rapunzel against, we get a lot more value from this book. That said, as a standalone book, I don't think Rapunzel and the Evil Witch works quite as well as the other books. And there is always a danger in a series that you can create a book that is unreadable without any other context. And I don't think that Pageau has done that here. This is a pretty strong book on its own, but it is clearly looking both backwards at previous stories and forwards to future stories in a way that Snow White and Jack and the Fallen Giants did not, to the same extent, look backwards or forwards. And that's understandable. This is the middle of a series. So all in all, I found the story very fun to read. It gives us a very interesting look at these decisions and the consequences that attend to them. And still, in spite of all of the negative things that happen to people, it is a hopeful story. It has a happy ending, but the path there is not as steady or clear cut as it might have been in another story. It's a very mature story in spite of subject matter, the artwork that looks more like it's aimed at children. But it's my experience that the most mature stories are for young children. So maybe that's not terribly surprising. Anyway, I found this to be a very good book. It has a $40 price tag, which is quite a bit for a children's story that is about 60 to 70 pages. But like I said, it's timeless. It is a very high quality book in the way it is constructed and the interior art. I think it's worth the cost of admission, especially if you have young kids who will be able to enjoy this and read it over and over again, possibly even inherit it and read it to their own kids. It is an investment that I think is worthwhile. So if you enjoy this kind of classic storytelling, be sure to check out Rapunzel and the Evil Witch. It is on sale right now from Symbolic World Press. So if you want your own copy, you don't have to wait for another Kickstarter to come around. You can go ahead and pick it up right now, maybe as a Christmas gift. I highly encourage it. This kind of storytelling, pretty rare in the modern time. And honestly, it may have been rare in the past too. It's worth supporting if this is what you want stories. If you've read this, let me know what you think of it down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I will talk to you later.